Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm I wonder whether you can sort of hear me clearly. Aromar Revi, and I'm helping sort of curate this massive open online course that a large number of you have joined. This is the second cycle that we're running on this course on sustainable cities. And there are a large number of you who are online just now from multiple parts of the world, all the way from Australia to, I believe, the east coast of the United States. I'm currently in the United Kingdom. I'm in the UK at an IPCC meeting. So we're all in multiple sort of time zones at this point of time. So this module, sort of on the urban opportunity, introduces the course and lays out a framework to understand some of the key questions that we're trying to address in sustainable cities. It highlights the urban opportunity of the 21st century and explores how cities are unique with their own sets of economic, political, historical, and cultural systems. It also discusses the urgency in achieving the SDGs within the next 15 years. The SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 11, to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. This course has been put together by a large number of colleagues from different parts of the world who've worked with us over the last many years to help define the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 11. And in this, in the session over this week, we've heard Edgar Peterser, a colleague from the University of Cape Town, who's talked about the challenges of urban politics and governance. And for advanced learners, we have another colleague from the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Jeannie Birch, talking about the challenges of urban research. And Professor Susan Parnell has highlighted the critical importance of knowledge, especially a knowledge of urban history and theory, to understand the complex urban context. Now, sustainable cities build on the extraordinary potential of urban areas to enable change, economic, social, cultural, technological change, due to the concentration of economic activity, innovation, and of course, something that we often forget, the potential for social transformation that cities actually provide for us. So over the next few weeks, or the next many weeks, we will examine how urban sustainability can be delivered, how cities function as systems, how we can increase urban productivity and reduce urban poverty and inequality, enable urban inclusion and safety, provide universal basic services, housing, infrastructure, water, energy, etc., protect the urban environment, and reduce residents and people who live in cities, from risk and vulnerability. We'll also learn about what needs to get done to improve urban governance and help finance sustainable development, especially in cities, and try and identify key key institutions and agents who will enable this to happen in cities. This week, of course, we've highlighted the urban opportunity of the 21st century and look at cities as critical centers for social and cultural transformation in human society across the world. We've taken examples from developing countries, from countries that are high and medium income, to get a sense of what kind of spread we actually we have. So I guess one of the first and most important points that we've tried to make here is that in this framework of sustainable urbanization, the artificial divide between the urban and the rural have limited space. In fact, in the network world of the 21st century, this is just a binary which probably has very little relevance. And in some senses, sustainable cities and towns and the countryside, that's rural areas, are not in contests. They're extensions of each other. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. You cannot have sustainable cities without having rural prosperity and addressing questions of rural poverty and empowerment. And the second thing, of course, is that the binary separation of human beings from nature, which set us apart from our environment, which may have been useful in other cultures, no longer works for us in this world, which has 7.5 billion people who are presenting a significant challenge to the biosphere. And of that, as we proceed over the next 15 or 20 years, we will move to having almost 5 billion people in cities. So our cities have to be reimagined as places that are dependent on fragile environments in rural and peripheral areas for their food, for their water, and of course for clean air. And then, of course, one very important question, which is critical for us to address, is the question of intergenerational equity and gender equity that will give strength to our fragile urban cultures. As we've seen in some of the sessions we've run in this module, a spark in one place can set another location alight unless we address the needs of billions of people, especially those who live in poverty, insecurity, and deprivation, every day of their lives. The great advantage we have in the early 21st century that we have immense wealth at our beck and call in some senses. Not everybody partakes in it. There are large numbers of poor and vulnerable people, but we have immense wealth in the world today. We also have technology and we have knowledge available to us, which can be put to use to address these core urban concerns. And finally, we have to ask the question of how much is enough. The question for us is, how can we address the immediate wants of all our fellow citizens? And how can we actually, um, you know, ask the question of whether we can consume less and less to be able to achieve both our material and non-material needs? Because it's not only a question of the well-being of our compatriots, our citizens, ourselves, but also that of our children, our grandchildren, and with them, all of life on the planet. The Sustainable Development Goals are actually a remarkable framework. Some of us, as I said, were involved in actually helping frame them. It was a remarkable experience for some of us to see all the countries of the world, 190 plus, coming together to agree politically that there are some things that are non-negotiable, that we have to end poverty, we have to end hunger, we have to provide basic services, social services like education and healthcare to everybody in the world, similarly energy and housing. And of course, as we use cities and places as an organizing principle to provide housing, basic services, security, the opportunity for employment that cities and urban areas actually provide us a great way of doing that. So in summary, what do the SDGs promise to deliver to us in the next, let's say, 14 years? The first and most critical is education and healthcare for all 5 billion urban residents by 2030. The second is somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people, depending on how you define informal settlements and slums. So to move 1 to 2 billion people from slums into secure housing with adequate services, water, energy, sanitation, and today the internet in some senses has become almost ubiquitous. Now, the critical challenge for us is to try and maintain and create about 600 million meaningful new jobs with better living conditions, better living and working conditions. This is going to be a serious challenge across the world, but in some senses, it is only sustainable cities that can actually deliver this. And to do this, we need to build the resilience and address informality, especially in the $90 trillion global urban economy. The global urban economy is very large. It's the most significant part of the global economy, and it's growing fairly rapidly. But I guess the most important thing is to build a more compassionate and inclusive urban culture via sustainable cities across the world. So those are the key things: education and healthcare for everybody, enabling people to move from slums into secure housing and adequate services, creating 600 million new meaningful jobs, and building a resilient, inclusive urban economy in every part of the world. Because the SDGs also make the commitment to do three things: to leave no one behind, which is a remarkable sort of commitment of all the nation states in the world; to leave no place behind, which is what the SDG talks about; and finally, to leave no ecosystem behind, because the ecosystems and their health are critical to the survival and management of our cities. So that's a quick introduction. As I said, many of you have actually viewed some of the sort of sessions that we've had over the last week or so. Those of you who have not, I would encourage you to go out and have a look at them. They're relatively short, but sometimes because they're quite dense in some senses, it might be useful to actually view them a number of times, because I know that a number of you are not native speakers. Maybe I'm speaking a little too fast for you. We're trying to make sure that in each of our sessions we have text actually available to you, which you can read, and we're trying an interesting new experiment in this in these modules of actually having text um, in Indian language, sort of in Hindi. So I believe some of you cannot hear me very clearly. Is it better now? I'm sort of, I'm on a broadband connection. Is it better, or is the sound actually too low for you at the current point of time? Yeah. Um, or maybe what I'll do is, if you give me sort of 30 seconds, I'll move to a headset so that it becomes a lot clearer. So give me 10, well, 30 seconds. I'll be back. So I'm putting on a headset. Should be back with you in as quickly as I can get it on, and maybe that will help improve the sound quality. Yeah. So here we are. Yeah. Is this better now? Is the sound better? Is it clearer? Great. So I'm imagining that this should help you hear me quite much clearer. So we have a number of questions that have come in today. The first question that I'll try and respond to is Natasha's. Natasha's asked the question of whether I think there's a link between the social capital of cities and their ability to accelerate economic change, and what constitutes social capital in the context of sustainable urban development. I'm not sure that social capital is, a completely adequate framework to address sustainable development, but I get your question. So, of course, people are central to cities, and um, cities actually grow and develop around people, around how societies are organized. So obviously, building on what some people call social capital, at the base, of course, you have to have citizens who are healthy. You have to have an educational system that works effectively for everybody. In fact, the SDGs speak explicitly about universal access to secondary education across the world. And of course, as we know that cities are the places where universities are located, you will typically find that universities provide sort of education in many parts of the world, and that will sort of enhance the access of urban citizens to education, and healthcare. But social capital, I guess, is more than that. It's really the connection between people, their institutions, and their communities. So one of the critical things that we found in many parts of the world is that if you invest in communities, if you invest in social processes, then you're able to address a whole range of questions, of which I think one of the most important ones is questions of inequality, whether it's gender inequality or it's stratification that you find because of class in some parts of the world, poor people, poorer people, and of course, people who have much better means actually being able to corner a lot of the resources. And in countries like mine, you have questions of caste and ethnicity, which are very important. So cities provide the opportunity, not only for economic transformation, that is improving the quality of life because incomes rise or potentially rise for some people, but also addressing questions of inequality. So if you look at the big struggles that we've seen over the last 150 years, including the struggle that women have had for political representation, for sort of, equal representation in terms of work and wages, where have they been fought? They've been fought in cities. So in some senses, um, so building the so-called social capital of cities is a very critical way of trying to enhance and release the kind of energies that we have, which will sort of accelerate and impact economic change. For example, if women are able to join the workforce on an equal footing, both in terms of access to jobs, in terms of wages,
in terms of adequate support for security and childcare in places where it's important, you immediately find that there's a growth in sort of in economic terms. But again, economic growth is not the only thing that you measure sustainability on. There's a question from Richard, which is on how do you empirically test social capital, given by nature that it's very endogenous. Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges with using the framing of social capital rather than looking at indicators of, let's say, gender equality, they're part of the SDG indicator set, or looking at questions of access, is that empirically testing that is somewhat, difficult to do. And you also make the point that big cities attract many people who may be willing to come together to solve common problems. So one of the things that one observes, and there's empirical data on this, is that cities enable not only economies of scale, which is, you have a larger city, so you have more infrastructure, infrastructure is cheaper, or you actually have social institutions that make them more functional, but the network effects of bringing together large numbers of people. Of course, if there's social stratification and there's asymmetries in urban societies, not everybody will have the opportunity to be able to participate as well as others. But typically, the network effects of just being able to, access new ideas, uh, to have access to knowledge, to have, access to a whole range of institutions that are important to economic activity, and of course, to dealing with social transformation, credit, for example, or access to jobs, are things that cities actually provide us with. And we really need to look at all the dimensions of sustainability, the economic, the social, and of course, sort of the ecological questions that are important for us to try and address. There's another question that we have from Romit. The question is about gentrification as an outcome of social transformation. Yeah. And okay, I believe that we are having some challenges with sound again. Is it a little better just now? I've tried to come a little bit closer to the microphone. Um, okay. So Romit's question is gentrification uh, is whether gentrification is an outcome of social transformation enabled by cities, and whether it's a positive transformation or a negative one. Now, gentrification happens for many reasons, and typically you find that either in inner city areas, where very often, especially in well-established cities, you find that poor people congregate because very often that's a place where they have access to um, jobs, to services, and a whole range of other things. And as those areas develop economically, um, prices rise. So prices of housing, prices of real estate, and that in a sense drives people out. And as richer people come in, of course, you have greater investments, so you have, improved quality of life, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure whether gentrification is an outcome of social transformation. Gentrification, in my experience, is driven a lot by a whole range of economic processes, especially unregulated, real estate markets, and to some extent labor markets. So that's a key driver of gentrification. And of course, people who are better off tend to congregate. They set up processes that may actually exclude other people, including by creating gated communities, which has become an unfortunate kind of process that we see happening in many parts of the world. And the question then is it a positive transformation or a negative one? For people who actually have access and who set up the gated communities, I would imagine they see this as a positive process. But as far as the city is concerned, as far as inclusive development is concerned, it's obviously something which is not a great thing to happen, because it pushes people out. It destroys the fabric in some sense of some areas. The question then is, how can you address gentrification? There are obviously, planning processes, there are economic processes which enable inclusion. But I think culture has a very important part to play in this. Some cities, even though you find the per capita incomes are relatively high, are actually much more inclusive. It really depends on the culture of the people and the willingness of them to actually stay together. Of course, planning and the locations of jobs and access to services has a lot to do with this, but culture is an important question. I have another question that's coming from Mahmood, which is, what are the challenges and opportunities for scaling up and replicating community or social best practices in sustainable cities management? Now, that is a huge question. We'll be addressing this in other parts in later sessions. Um, so obviously, community-based processes are something that are rooted in local realities. They're not only within a region, but certainly within a country, and sometimes within a city, depending on who actually lives there. Cities are not homogeneous sort of communities. There's a lot of differentiation by caste, by class, by age, by gender. So the idea of best practices is sometimes a little bit problematic. I mean, in some ways, for managerial kind of approaches or approaches that use, let's say, economic development as the organizing principle, that might be a good way of framing things. I think the whole question of how one mobilizes communities, how one actually works with communities to enable social transformation through a process of inclusion, is something that we wouldn't necessarily call best practices. So, like I said earlier, both in my responses to the question on gentrification and how one builds social capital, so to speak, these are important processes. They depend on how governance is organized, how local community mobilization takes place, on the relationship within and between communities, and they can make a dramatic difference in social outcomes. So, for example, if you look at, and we'll be describing it later, some of the really interesting social housing and infrastructure processes in Bangkok, and there's a case about that. They were really built over many years by bringing people together, people who, in some cases, were vulnerable, people who didn't have too much resources, some of them were effectively poor, but by working together, by sharing processes, by engaging with both the public administration, that's the municipal administration, and bringing together services, they've actually been able to achieve a lot more than if they were just individuals who are trying to work within a market-based environment to do things. So I'm not saying that social mobilization is, let's say, a replacement for the market, or something that's sort of competitive with it, but it seems to be an essential part of being able to build the fabric of sustainable of cities. We have another interesting question from Eliza Castro on what is a plan to make an SDG work at city level if the UN is usually communicating with state authorities and not the cities. This is a real challenge. In fact, I think the creation of the urban SDG happened because of, or SDG 11 as we call it, happened because of two things. One was a mobilization of city and regional leaders who said, look, we are part of this process. This is something that we're actually leading on. And the second thing is the realization from the point of view of what we call member states of the UN, countries, that they cannot do this alone. This is a massive and remarkable agenda, but that agenda cannot be delivered by nation states on its own. And to take a very contemporary example, the United States announced last week that it was pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. So that's a nation state saying, this doesn't work for us. We signed up for it in a previous administration, but now we're stepping out of this. And what has happened? There's been a remarkable mobilization. I was, even today, I was with colleagues from C40 and otherwise, who have literally over the last 3 or 4 days, first mobilized 61 mayors, and today I think the number is 250. 250 cities, starting with New York City, and Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, is somebody who I've known and was part of this process. De Blasio actually signed up on a very clear agreement saying, it's an executive order which says that New York will actually implement the Paris Climate Accord. And there are over 200 mayors in the US who've signed up to do this, along with, I think, half a dozen regional governors. So the governor of California has signed up saying California will do the same thing. So essentially, we are coming into a new era, at least in my appreciation, where we have to establish a partnership between the local the national, and of course the global. Because if you want to try and implement many of the SDGs, like providing universal water supply or better housing conditions in a city like Manila, or in Karachi, or even in let's say Accra, it means mobilizing resources locally. But sometimes you have to draw upon national resources, and in some cases for infrastructure projects or other things, or new technologies like solar photovoltaics, which will make, let's say, the Paris Climate Accord possible, you need international assistance in terms of technology, in terms of resources. So it's really a multi-scalar agenda that connects the local with the regional, with the national, and with the global. And I think that's what cities are bringing us. And I think that's what the new discourse around sustainable cities is all about. It's about a partnership which is working very effectively across cities across the world, but also within national contexts. So the UN's role is to create a facilitative environment to try and bring together member states to try and do things together, and also set up a process by which we are able to track what the outcomes are. So one of the big things that's happening at the moment is the indicators and the targets that we set up for the SDGs are now starting to be measured. And later this year at the UN General Assembly in September, and earlier at the High Level Political Forum in July, a number of countries are actually measuring how they're performing. And I think one of the most important things that we've seen from last year's assessment, which was done by UNSTSN, the Sustainable Development Index, and my colleagues who are part of this process have done the similar thing for India, and it's happening in many other countries, is a very clear message that even Sweden, which is in some senses at the top of the Sustainable Development Index, has a long way to go on some questions, and other countries, including high-income countries, are also developing in some facet of the other. You find, for example, and I've just taken the example of the United States, the US experiences high degrees of inequality, especially in urban areas. So it's not that homelessness is something that you only find on the streets of Caracas or Mumbai or whatever it is. You can find homelessness in New York, you can find homelessness in London, etc. So inequality is a dimension that needs to be addressed across cities across the world. And the UN is going to give us has given us a framework in which we can measure this in different places and actually compare them. So the idea that cities of the global south are the only places where there are challenges is not a true one, because we now have evidence that shows us that on environmental conditions, some of the largest cities in the world emit 15 to 20 tons per capita of carbon, and they have serious challenges in terms of addressing carbon neutrality. In other places, in many parts of the world, you have serious questions of unemployment. So the sort of the SDGs embrace all of these questions, and by embracing all of these questions, it gives us a framework to look holistically at the social, economic, and ecological development of cities. So this is going to be obviously a contested question. It will take I would say maybe a decade or maybe a couple of decades to actually work itself out. But it's inevitable. If more than half of humanity already lives in cities, 5 billion of us will live in cities over the next 15 or 20 years. Two-thirds of the global economy is situated in urban areas. That we have to engage with these questions. We can't run away from them. And frankly, the solutions are to be found locally, but they have to be embedded in larger agendas. We have a question from Anjali, which says it's a particular question to India, which says, in cities as diverse in India as India, how can it be ensured that by using the SDGs, the city administration sort of tries and enables capacity building? Now, it's going to take some time for the Sustainable Development Agenda to be understood by people in many different environments. You know, uh, in countries like India, or in countries that have been part of the Millennium Development Process, which started in about 2000 and closed in 2015, at least development professionals and in some cases government officials are aware of the fact that we have development goals and that we have to get, you have to get there. You have to address them in a limited time frame. I think the first big question is that we have to educate people, both people in government, people in enterprises, and certainly citizens, that these are things that their national governments have agreed to do. And they've not agreed to do it in the abstract, they've agreed to do it in a time frame. So when we're talking about universal provision of water supply in 30 years' time, you have to work backwards from, let's say, a 99% or 100% provision to the current situation where you have maybe 60% of the city that actually has, adequate water, or sanitation, which is an even worse case in many parts of the world. So these are tangible, clear goals. They may not encompass everything that we want, but these are big questions which the countries of the world have agreed to deliver. And I guess the question for us is, how do we make our city officials at the national level in India, at the state level, and at the city level aware that they have to deliver these questions? They are not justiciable by law. You can't go into a court and say, this city or that government has not delivered to us. But they are clear commitments which are political. And I guess we have to hold our leaders, to be responsible for what they've agreed to do that. There's a question from Vaishali on how effectively and how quickly will it be possible to bring together sustainable development in transport or energy or water. Fine. I was just in a discussion just now with one of the leading sustainable transportation people in the world, Peter Newman, who you'll meet sometime later in the process. And we are trying to define just now for the IPCC how we can enable a mobility transition across the world. So, I mean, there are trends which are quite surprising. I mean, many of us in countries which are less developed, or let's say low or middle income countries, have the impression that the car is the only way forward in terms of modernity, in terms of how urban systems should be organized. But in actual practice, both in our cities, which have very strong elements of public transportation and walking. I mean, the large numbers of poor people who actually walk to work in cities like Mumbai. I guess a mix of public transport and walking to work, or active transport, maybe 30-40% of modal share, is not only there, but the trend in Europe certainly, and in increasingly North America, is that motorization is starting to decline. That means people are using cars less and less, and I think China is going to see a very rapid decline in the use of personal motor vehicles. Number one. Number two, we are seeing a complete disruption of the idea that everybody's got to own a vehicle by the introduction of new internet-based technologies, the so-called Uberization of transport, which is changing the nature of transport. In some, let's say, high-income countries, they're even talking about autonomous vehicles, which I think are going to be a challenge in other parts of the world. But in all of them, we hope to see a significant shift to electric vehicles. So what does that mean? When we shift to electric vehicles, it means that emissions go down, so air quality hopefully should improve quite rapidly, because if you have electric vehicle fleets for both public transportation and private transportation, your emissions decline considerably. It also means that carbon emissions come down. That means that the impact of let's say, greenhouse gases on all of us in the long run is actually going to be worse. Also, in very tangible terms, electric vehicles tend to be much more silent. So just in terms of being able to not be exposed to noise pollution, you're actually making a significant change. And if that is combined with adequate changes in our planning frameworks, so that cars don't actually destroy the urban landscape by being located on every street and outside every house, because what you need is mobility and not actually owning the car. That will actually transform our fabrics. There are parts of the world where, like Vienna, for example, one of the first cities to significantly pedestrianize. And if you look at the center of New York, pedestrianization has come to some of the more sort of densely traffic, areas which were completely sort of clogged with traffic, like the area around Times Square. As soon as you start doing that, people start reclaiming the streets, as we've seen in Bogota, as we've seen in many other parts of the world. So SDGs are about tangible, concrete things. Of course, they measure them in different ways so that we can compare between one city and the other. But these things are happening across the world. The sort of reduction of motorization, the shift to electric vehicles, or the shift to photovoltaics is a dramatic change that's happening in many parts of the world. And I think courses like ours are trying to be able to show people how things happen not only in their environments but in other places, and we have to try and see how we can translate them into our um, uh, own context. There's an interesting question which may be tied to this that comes from Shrey Mathur, which is about what the role of public outreach can play in achieving the SDGs. And as I said earlier, um, awareness and mobilization around your rights and around good things that we know can actually happen is very important. And I guess with social media, with the internet, we're not where we were, I would say, even 5 years ago. So the opportunity that many of us have now, finding out what's happening in London, what's happening in Tokyo, what's happening in Kathmandu, what's happening, in Nairobi, is a good way of trying to understand what changes can be made. And we found in the last cycle of this course that as we had people from about 100 countries as part of it, as people actually form groups between, let's say, Manila and Karachi and Barcelona, they were actually able to work on addressing practical questions. How do I deal with solid waste management in my neighborhood? And exchange those experiences across different cities. So you understand context, you understand how implementation can actually work, and you understand how you can take local innovation and scale it not only within the city but between cities. So for that, obviously, public outreach is very, very critical and important. And I think each of us have a role to play. If you get out onto Twitter and to Facebook and you tell these stories, it's also about trying to understand how we can take those ideas from one location and take it to another, which is what we'll be dealing with in other locations. There's an interesting question from Salil Mohan about cities that are growing in size and density, but the fact that job opportunities and infrastructure upgradation don't meet the sort of pace of growth. And he's asked about how we can define the carrying capacity of the city. Now that's a big technical question. There's a lot of academic debate on this question of what carrying capacity is. But yes, I guess there are two different things. One is the growth of size. So one size, of course, and the most important thing is population size. So as urbanization increases, cities will grow in size. But remember, we're talking about an urban system. So growing in size doesn't mean that every city becomes a metropolitan city. In fact, in much of the world, most of the growth that we're seeing just now is happening in what we call secondary cities, in smaller places. And in smaller places, actually trying to achieve sustainability becomes much more real, much more pragmatic, and actually can be done. And we're hoping that many of you who come from smaller places can really try and take these ideas and see whether we can try and implement them, try and engage with them, and try and sort of address them. So the first question is about city size. The second question is about density. Now, of course, in principle, cities are much denser than villages. Yeah, there are a lot more people and they come together in a smaller space. But what we've seen across many parts of the world, and there's a wonderful resource that's produced by an old colleague and friend, which is called the Atlas of Urban Expansion. Solly Angel from NYU has produced it. It was released by uh, the head of UN Habitat at Quito last year. One of the essential sort of lessons we learned from the Atlas of Urban Expansion is that we've had the growth of sprawl pretty much across the world. I mean, this is a generalization, but most cities across the world have actually not only grown in population size, but they've actually they've grown by they expanding their boundaries by ribbon development on the outside, and this has led to an interesting impact that the mean densities actually, even though the overall population may actually grow, the mean densities of the cities in many places are actually declining, especially in the inner city areas, right? So it's not always true that the growth in size and the growth in density come together. Now, the question of job opportunities is somewhat related to the question of size and density, but it's also related to economic structure. It's also related to how a city is connected to the hierarchy of urban settlements, and how it's connected to the larger world in terms of, is it a port city? Does it have good transportation and rail connections? Are there a whole range of enterprises that are located here? So the job opportunities are related sometimes to size and density, but they're also related to a whole range of other questions, which we'll deal with in a latter session. So the carrying capacity question is a tough one to deal with, because let's say if we take the footprint of the city of, let's say, something like water, the urban footprint for water is often very different from the urban footprint for, let's say, food. So the water footprint of a large metropolitan city may extend to, let's say, 100, 150 kilometers, sometimes more than that in areas which are seriously challenged. But it can extend quite to a fair extent into the region. But the footprint, because we draw food from many different sources and from many different areas, may extend over a much larger area. In fact, many large metropolitan cities have food that come in literally from across the world. Yeah. So the question of carrying capacity is a multidimensional question. There are multiple carrying capacities as far as that's concerned. So in effect, we have to look at multiple currencies of sustainability. So we have to look at the sustainability of food, the sustainability of timber and biomass, sustainability of the use of water, and we have to have metrics to measure them, and we have to look at the boundaries somewhat differently. So sustainable cities is not a simple thing to deal with, and we have to try and understand how to differentiate between these questions and address them. There's a question from Deepa Rodriguez on a big part of the challenge of mass immigration to urban areas is in terms of access to services. And this is a common question that we find from across the world of how can we keep people in rural areas and not allow them to come into cities. And this is also a important political question. The thing, of course, is in many countries of the world, the constitutions that they have actually say that people can live wherever they want to. There's no particular reason why people should live only in rural areas or urban areas. So let me take the example of China. So China, like a few other countries in the world, has had for a long period of time, almost what 3.5, 4 decades or so, a system which is called the hukou, where rural residents are essentially allowed to stay in rural areas and they have entitlements, to enable them. And urban residents are entitled to live in urban areas. So the challenge of urbanization in China has been there have been large numbers of people that have gone from rural to urban areas. They are what we call migrants, um, and they don't actually have the entitlements that urban residents have. And that's been the cause of a lot of inequality and a lot of challenges that we've seen in Chinese urbanization. So even in spite of the fact that it's been the most rapid urbanization in all of history, the question of the hukou and the separation out between rural and urban areas has been a difficult one. And in fact, in the last few years, China has started relaxing its sort of policy, which didn't allow rural residents to stay in urban areas or become urban citizens or residents over a long period of time. But in principle, um, you cannot, like I said earlier, you cannot address questions of rural prosperity without allowing people the opportunity to come to cities. And effectively, in many parts of the world, people come to cities for jobs. They also come to cities to help improve, the education of their children and a whole range of other things. People also come to cities to improve their social opportunities. So creating barriers, frankly, doesn't work. Even creating barriers between countries to migration that doesn't work. The question for us is how can we preemptively provide the opportunity for migrants to find jobs, to find housing, to find adequate access to services, to become citizens who contribute to the life of the city. Because to be frank, the bulk of cities across the world, both in history and even now, the ones that are rapidly growing, have been built on the back of the labor of people who are less advantaged. The question, of course, today is, can we provide for the social security, the services, the education, the healthcare, and the basics, what the SDGs promise to everybody, so that migrants are able to then um, uh, be able to contribute and not, in some senses, be challenged by having to live in poor living conditions, and subsidizing, in some senses, the buoyant growth of cities by their own living um, conditions. Um, there's a question from Georgios on whether tourism is a threat for sustainable development. Yes, in many parts of the world, tourism has become a mass industry. It does create a whole range of challenges. Of course, you can have sustainable tourism. It's a question of being able to choose and plan and organize processes, and you have to be able to respect not only the monuments and the sort of built heritage, but the living heritage, the people who actually make up the city, because it's really that draws people to the city. It's what other people have built and made, and I think addressing questions of tourism in many parts of the world. It's a key driver of the economies of both high income countries. Venice, for example, is a city which is almost significantly driven by the tourist trade. Or in other parts of the world, which low and middle income countries, people come there to be able to experience things that they're not able to do otherwise. But there's no reason why, um, that should destroy the fabric or the living environment of the cities. Um, there is uh, an interesting question from Romit Singla on whether iconic large-scale infrastructure can help redefine the way of life for a society. Now, if you look at the history of urbanization, starting 5,000 years ago, emperors and kings and people who used to extract taxes and resources from ordinary people used to build remarkable structures, and they used to sort of display their wealth and their power in cities that they built and the palaces that they built. Um, the question, I guess, today is whether this kind of iconic infrastructure has got very much use in a world in which, like I said, less than less there are at least a billion or more people who live in informal settlements. So you can build iconic infrastructure; it gives you a sense of identity. But can you do what they did in Medellin, which is to actually put libraries in the center of informal settlements? And in some senses, those libraries are iconic infrastructure because it shows people that even poor people have the need to and the opportunity to access knowledge, and they've actually helped transform those communities. So yes, you can use iconic infrastructure, but I think there's a cost and a benefit to that, and we have to look at the trade-offs very carefully. It might give a particular mayor or a particular president, something to talk about, and people, it may help them in the future. But I think the SDGs start with the idea of putting the most vulnerable first. It talks about leaving no one behind. And if iconic infrastructure can do that, then that's fantastic. But in some cases, what it does is that it excludes. It pushes people out because you have a transportation system or a big stadium for a large sports event that pushes out people and doesn't actually enable them to live harmoniously and provide them the rights that they're required to have. So, we've got a lot of questions here, and I don't think I will be able to sort of answer them. I think there are about 20 of you who are still waiting. I've got a list of maybe 30, 40 questions that need to be addressed. I'll just pick up a couple of them and sort of start wrapping up. Um, so, so there's a question from, I don't have the full name here. There's a question about how you can look at metropolitan regions to address, urban agriculture, to address the question that I was just dealing with just now, water footprint, food footprint issues. Now, let me give you an example from North America, not from the United States, but from Canada. One of the most, let's say, livable cities in the world, and it's also a city that comes very high, on the index of the best places to live in, is a city called Vancouver. Now, Vancouver is interesting not only because it's in a high-income country and it's got wonderful sort of natural resource environments. It's got the sea, it's got the mountains, and all that kind of other stuff that's there. But it took a very bold decision in the late 1970s. It was the first city in North America that rejected the passing of an expressway, what we call flyovers in other parts of the world, through the heart of the city. At that point of time, the idea was that if you wanted to be modern, everybody had to have access to personal transportation, which was a car. And because the car tends to create congestion, you had to have, these expressways that connected to the city and then cut through the city to get you from one place to the other rather quickly. So Vancouver, for a whole range of reasons, was the first city that said, we do not want an expressway, number one. The second thing that it did, which is very interesting, was that it actually implemented what we call greenbelt regulations. So normally what happens in some cities is that outside the so-called city boundary, which you have to look at rather carefully because in cities that grow very rapidly, the boundaries move quite quickly. So you set up something which is called a green belt that actually provides the ecosystem services, the food, the water, the flood control measures, etc., which are very critical to sustainable urbanization. Now, Vancouver did a very interesting thing. They actually designated a green belt not in the normal way, which says, that this is in a master plan or some other sort of quasi-legal document. Actually, for perpetuity, set out a set of legal arrangements by which the land use could not change from agriculture, and that provided a very strong relationship between local agriculture and services, and the city itself. They also had a very interesting policy by which everybody had access to the waterfront. So the public waterfronts of Vancouver are not, you can't have a private house which is able to break up the waterfront and anybody can access it. So it sort of democratized access to natural resources. So by doing remarkable things like this, by focusing on public transportation, by condensing the density of the city, by providing for basic agricultural services, and thinking ahead in terms of using hydropower, let's say, to power the city, and using renewables, it is one of the more livable cities in the world. And that's true of many other regions. So when you think about sustainability in terms of resources, you have to think about regions. And I started with that, saying that the urban and the rural is a dichotomy that's not very useful. We have to look at regional processes, which means that we look at a hierarchy of settlements, starting from small villages, larger towns, and eventually, maybe million cities and a few metropolitan centers. And it's a connection between them that make the big difference. It is the networks between them and the availability of economic opportunity, the availability of social opportunity that gives us the ability to then try and look at cities as the sites in which we can try and implement sustainability. It's not going to be easy. It takes time, and to sort of implement a holistic agenda that draws on all of the SDGs. You know, we need to end urban poverty, but you can't address urban poverty unless you address questions of employment, of decent jobs, of urban productivity, which means that you have to look at infrastructure. You can't run production enterprises without having energy, so you need to have clean energy to make that possible. In order to be able to provide clean energy, you have to look at household productions through photovoltaics, or let's say the production of energy through other renewables like wind farms or hydroelectric power. That means you have to relate the city to excuse me, the region. And if people have to live and work effectively, the urban structure has to be such that they can they can either work very close to where they're living, or they can move from one location to the other quite effectively. And the housing that they live in and the workplaces that they live in are safe. They have to be affordable because large numbers of people, especially in the places where urbanization is going to become very important in the world, and in, let's say, in parts of Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, where 70 or 80% of the urbanization is yet to come, we need to provide a built environment that is not only inclusive socially, but also affordable. Because it's no fun if you're a person who's just come to the city, or whose incomes are low, but you want to help it rise, to be pushed out to the periphery of the city. So we need to look at these questions in an integrated manner to be able to realize the economies of scale that cities provide us, the economies of scope that enable the connection between us, uh, the opportunities to be able to use a whole range of things that are not monetized. You know, social relations are very critical, and to protect the environment and use renewable resources to be able to ensure that the sustainability of the resource flows in the city are actually maintained. So the SDGs, especially SDG 11 and the rest of them that are tied to that, provide a framework for us to be able to try and understand where we are, where we need to get to, and how quickly we need to get there. So what we're going to be dealing with over the next few sessions is, what are the systems that make up the city? The water system, the housing system, the economic system, etc., etc. How does one look at social questions within that? And then how do we put that together to be able to enable the economic development of cities locally and regionally? And then, of course, questions of risk and resilience, which are very critical, because as we bring together people in the city, it not only creates opportunity, but it creates a lot of challenges in terms of civil strife at one end, and security, but also challenges of cities being hit by by a hurricane or a cyclone or a flood, which can then disrupt life for everybody. So we're looking at all of those things. And finally, we try and pull together a set of ideas and a whole range of examples. There'll be people who'll be speaking to you from across the world who have experience of trying to implement these processes, people who are implementing these things in many places, people who are understanding of them because they're academics or practitioners, to try and show you what the possibilities are to try and make this change. Because in some senses, we have less than a decade and a half to do this, to make things a lot better for us. And if we do that, I think we have the opportunity of building a rather different um, world. But it depends on us, and it depends on using our ingenuity, our innovation, and our commitment to making that possible. So I think that might not be a bad place to sort of close at. And thank you so much for joining us. Do stay tuned. We're going to have a webinar every week, and there'll be different colleagues who will come in and talk about that. You'll have the opportunity of asking questions to some of the more interesting people in the world who've actually done this thing and have framed this process. And I know it's a long course, but if you do take the time every week to stay up and catch up with what's happening and on the quizzes, I think, like the many thousands of people who've done this before, you will find this a really interesting opportunity, a great opportunity for dialogue, to meet other people who are like yourselves, and trying to find answers, because we don't have ready answers to everything. And hopefully, in some solidarity, we can do something interesting as we move forward on implementation. So thank you very much, and good morning, good night, and good afternoon, depending on where you are.